Featured on CNN Design 360, Huffington Post Design, a frequently invited design school critic, and a prolific lecturer, Professor Curry's continued scholarship and experience includes the peer-edited / reviewed journals, Critical Productive, and Appendix, literary works and exhibition curation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Milton Curry. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to MOCAD for inviting me. So when I got the, and thank you for coming. When I got the invitation to lecture on Anri Sala's films, it was, I guess, could be considered an odd call because I'm an architect. So what would I have to say about these films? You could ask, and it was. Odd also because I have seen several Sala films, and one of them struck me quite a bit when I arrested me really when I went into the gallery to see it. It's a film, Time After Time, which this is a still from that film, but it was in a series called Point of View. This work is from 2003 by Anri Sala, and it's a 5-minute film, about the length of one of the films here, and it depicts this horse, languid and in distress on a busy highway, mostly a static camera shot, but in each frame there's really something uneasy, a twitching or some flicker of the light that goes off that is slightly off, and finally the horse's leg raises and attempts to gain kind of a foothold on the highway railing. And it really speaks to an interesting kind of patience that Sala has in terms of his the nuances that he's able to achieve with his camera work. And also what I'll talk about tonight is what I think is a political content that is in a way embedded in these very synthetic scenarios that he manufactures in his films. So another reason why the timing was appropriate, as Katie mentioned, I've been engaged in recent years in work that really is around trying to find the political within the aesthetic. And in other words, to redevelop in some ways and renovate a political dimension to the discussion of form, space, and place that really begins to pull politics and aesthetics in closer tension with one another in their contextual relationship. So a lot of times modernism, particularly modern architecture, has been plagued by this notion that it's not contextual unless it has certain aesthetic characteristics that in a way blend or begin to recombine with the context. But there are other ways to be contextual, and one of them is to go a little bit more nuanced and to see the political that might be embedded within the aesthetic, both the new work as well as existing city conditions, urban conditions. So I've made a couple of attempts at that. Katie mentioned the piece in Harlem World, which is an invited exhibition in 2004. The journal is also an attempt at that, Critical Productive. And I think in these and other works, the point is to try to resolve, in quotation marks, the condition of architecture's aversion, in a way, to making the aesthetic political and in making the political aesthetic. So I'll try to work through some thoughts on that this evening, and I'll warn you that they're not fully formed yet, so there'll be some quotations of others trying to integrate that into my own thinking. Okay, so what I'll sketch out today is really a provisional way into Anri Sala's work, but more importantly, try to offer a set of ideas on how we can still engage the political within the aesthetic regime of thought, and we could say that the aesthetics and the aesthetic regime of thought, in a way, predominates the discussion of the political at this point. Very different from the 60s, for example. I like this quote. This is a quote that comes from Mark Bradford, an artist who recently had a show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And he says, and I quote, "I want to engage a social, political conversation about the contemporary world that I live in or my relationship to it, and at the same time, I want to abstract it," end of quote. And I think that for someone like Mark Bradford, maybe who's an artist and contemporary artist, and for someone like Anri Sala, I think that's very apropos to a kind of an artist executing their work in a post-modern, post-modernity period in which, on the one hand, they want to deploy the aesthetic tactics that are contemporary and that show a kind of resolution of craft in a certain way. At the same time, they're not interested in the overt political project, but instead in something about the political embedded within a kind of project of abstraction, which I'm going to not speak for him, but I'm going to project that into a notion that perhaps the political can be more powerful in the abstract than in the overt. So I'll break up the talk into three different sections: translating film into narrative, identifying techniques, tropes, and formal moves, and then finally, critical frame. Translating film into narrative. The two films by Anri Sala, Damia Colore and Long Sorrow, are aphorisms on the city, we could say. In the case of Give Me Colors, the translation that I'll use in English for Damia Colore. In the case of Give Me Color, the city is Tirana, Albania, a very poor city in Europe. In the case of Long Sorrow, the city is Berlin, Germany, a very wealthy European city. They represent the cities that they act to decipher through and with the visual media of film. And what is the narrative of these films? And I ask the question knowing that the intention of the films, both films, is to be non-narrative. But I'm asking the question this way because the way that we cohere the city is in very many ways based on a narrative, whether that starts out as a narrative or not. And so the question of what is the narrative of these films, or more aptly, what is the role of narrative in these films? And in Give Me Color, the narration takes very, very different forms. There is the touristic vision that I think is encapsulated by the nighttime film shots that depict the city space and the urban landscape without people on the street. And you see an image here where he's really just moving the camera along the street, and with the light that's being projected is making silhouette images out of the scaffolding that's both on the ground floor and above. And that creates, in a way, a visual narrative as these tracking shots begin to move and pick up different colorations and different views of the city, and at the same time beginning to insert text on top of that image to force, again, another notion of narration that might be happening. So, so there's a sense that these are, that one is moving through the city in a vehicle, not walking because the pace would be too slow, and then is getting these snippets of text that are beginning to overlay another dimension on the film, kind of a voiceover in some ways. And so these nighttime film shots and the strategy that he uses for depicting the city as city space and urban landscape is kind of an ultimate architectural perspective of buildings. A lot of times we're viewing or representing buildings as singular objects without people that gives us really, the clearest dimension of what the building's facade and what its aesthetics are about. With this as the overriding narrative at play, Sala makes visual and narrative incisions and cuts across the grain of this narrative to insert day scenes with people, and active shots with painters and construction workers laboring over the city's transformation. And so just to move through some sequential shots from the film, one with an everyday scene, not during the night but during the day, and then another day shot that captures a very different kind of scene than his tracking work in the nighttime scenes. And finally, the action continues with the last form of incision, which is the form of, comes in the form of authority. With the mayor, Eddie Rama, a longtime friend and sometime collaborator of Sala's, in the protective spatial envelope of the taxi cab, espousing the virtues of simply enlivening his city by painting facades with different colors. In Long Sorrow, Sala abandons any nod to a linear narrative and instead grounds the camera and its main figures in aerial space, filming the opening frame within a vacant Berlin apartment 18 floors above ground and training the camera on a window frame with an obscure figure set within. The film unfolds with an improvisational jazz piece by musician Jamil Mundak, who himself is slowly revealed as the obscure figure floating in air on the edge of the window frame. And that shot opens a little bit wider and then continues to hone in on the window until the window absorbs the entire frame. The camera shot continues to move closer. The city below comes into view, as do vegetation and additional visual effects that create vertical and horizontal diptychs within the filmic frame. The viewer is captive, the perspective constrained, and the city held in freeze frame is a salient backdrop to the interplay of music and pure form. And again, the camera moves and begins to sway at a certain point to oscillate this figure horizontally, and then comes up to it closer and closer. And then the diptych kind of switches to a horizontal where the window frame is functioning as a reflection for both the combination of the figure's headpiece in the center as well as the vegetation, which is 18 floors down below on either side of the figure. So it's a very clever framing and how, without changing really the camera's focus, the total image of what's in foreground, what's in background begins to flip. And then we get a view of the city in total. Translating film into narrative structure is an uncomfortable technique that Sala would probably resist. I use it because this is the language of city making. It's how we describe the urban space to public and private interests, the unfolding of realities that can be neatly narrativized into built form. Now, because narrative alone is inadequate to describe these and other filmic works, particularly those in the genre of single and multi-channel video, I'll now delve into some limited amount of techniques, tropes, and formal moves that will transition us into a broader discussion of the critical interventions into what this all means or could mean for creative work on cities. In the three or so following examples, the city is seen as a depiction. And in fact, the problematic of cohering a city, understanding a city as such, is seen to be a problem of perception as much as it is a problem of comprehension. If we can depict a city, perhaps not the city, but a city among many, we can cohere the city as an interpretive lens. And Jacques Herzog and Pierre Demeron in Culture Zone in 2010 commented on cities in relation to their commission to design a stage set for a metropolitan opera, Attila. And they said, quote, cities are a kind of petrified psychogram of our societies, end quote. Whether an opera aficionado or not, I believe almost everyone is spellbound by the productions at the Metropolitan Opera because of the expense and the scale of them. But particularly in the Herzog and Demeron set design for Pierre Audi's production of Giuseppe Verdi's Attila at the Metropolitan Opera, an opera first performed in 1846. Their depiction of the ruined city of Aquilera, set up as a meticulous pile of concrete rubble in which persons appear as stage props, barely able to find space to position themselves, is only the beginning of an unfolding that takes place with the set design of a spectacularly surreal journey to the ruins of ancient Italy and the ethereal beauty yet to come of a renewed and lushly vegetated Venice. Their use of a filmic split screen that places the powerful on the set's top tier with the severe horizontal spatial lines separating the masses down below, clothed in Miucci Prada creations in this particular instance, reified the large stakes of splitting up the Roman Empire. So there's political representation embedded within the aesthetic logic, obviously of the opera itself, but also in the meticulous kind of stage set design that Herzog and Demeron are involved in. The intense lighting, which I don't have a slide of here, of the vegetative screen that comes down in scenes that follow these, is also surreal. This staging of the city is inventive and instructive because it reveals city making in reverse. And even though this is a stage set, it's executed by major contemporary architects. And the idea of beginning to construct or deconstruct the city in such a way that we would be thinking about the city in reverse, from the rubble back to civilization, back to a kind of coherent form that we could understand as being a functioning city, is, I think, an interesting example to look at in relation to those projections of cities which tend to be forward-looking, putting renderings forth of a new city or so forth. Likewise, in Francesco Rossi's brilliant filmic visual depiction of real estate speculation and political complexities, and Mani sulla Città, Hands Over the City, produced in 1963, he stages what appears to be documentary footage of the collapse of a slum tenement in a community struggling to stave off their neighborhood's gentrification. Eduardo Notolo, played here by Rod Steiger, navigates the halls of power, his own sparely modern offices, and the neighborhoods he intends to redevelop with relative ease. The space of the city is his own, as is the expansive visual frame Rossi affords him to storm in and out of urban areas and council chambers. He's telling somebody off here. This is the mayor, again, from the taxi cab shot in Sala's film, Long Sorrow. In Lagos Wide and Close, a film by Rem Koolhaas, looking at Africa and Lagos, Koolhaas stages his presence within an aestheticized African city bursting at the seams, he too is deploying the split screen and montage to achieve frame-by-frame visual saturation. In addition, he deploys audio maneuvers that allow the viewer to mix and match audio with different visual scenes of the city that don't align with one another. And so I think in the case of this film, which is in a way a kind of faux documentary critical project, there are the split screen as you see here, another example of a split screen to show multiple conditions within the same site, within the same city. Aesthetic flourishes which begin to take this city into much more an abstract fabric. These are aerial views that are contorted and kind of torqued. And so these are different strategies which we see being used to depict urban conditions. And I put Sala in this, in a way, in the same genre. To return to Sala's films, the techniques used tell a different story than straight narrative. In Give Me Color, the filmic techniques blend city with nature. By filming primarily at night, the buildings and their context achieve greater simpatico. Ground uninhabited becomes soil. Buildings as a backdrop for nothing but the camera's light become pure surface. The elision of ground, landscape, and building, while absenting human occupation, is a clear technical shift from a genre of documentation and documentary film to one of absenting presence, or we could say staging a synthetic presence. The topic of urban decay and the paradoxical mayoral gesture of positing that coloration can change perceptions is a provocatively empty signification of the real work of urban transformation. That is, the political, economic, labor-intense, and time-intensive work to change or to transform a city. And we see that in Detroit. The technique of resorting to a documentary interview of the mayor after having surveyed the city is to retreat to a trope, perhaps, that allows power its last word on the matter, no matter how incongruent the words may be in relation to the images, spaces, and forms shown prior to. In Long Sorrow, the main filmic techniques are more nuanced and embed a form of alienation that is in sync with urbanization and its actual impacts. By first dropping us into the 18th floor apartment that is empty, Sala signals to the viewer that the starting point, in fact the standpoint epistemology for the film, will be self-made, even though more information unfolds through the framing and the opening up of that frame and that interiority to the exteriority of the city. He signals at the very beginning of the film that it's going to be several minutes that we find before we can really locate the kind of space that we're in, that he's moving us from within to outside. The building project that Sala is filming in is a building built between 1964 and 1974 by the Association for Social Apartment Construction in Berlin, and originally a part of Wittenau, part of an urban complex that used to house 17,000 inhabitants. On the web, I looked today, it apparently houses 36,000, and is in an area of Berlin that is different today than it was due to the Berlin Wall coming down, for example. By the time the scenes unfold in Long Sorrow, by the time that they unfold long enough for us to view the apartment from its outside, its exterior, we know that the figure is human, the jazz player, the improvisational jazz figure, but also that the figure is a sonically audible figure, made superhuman by virtue of his bodily position on the edge of the window, the ledge of the window. The city comes into view. The relationship between building and vegetation is inescapable, as is the haunting images of blank walls, lighting apparatuses, and the cloudy sky with the single airplane gliding horizontally out of the frame at the end of the film. Now, I'd like to put both the narrative interpretation and the technical dimensions of the works into a broader critical frame. Or better put, what is the meaning-making relationship between these films, the contemporary metropolis, and the subject position relative to issues of politics and aesthetics? And I'll read here just a quote by Sabine Haney, professor at Cornell in Film Studies, from a piece that will be coming out in Critical Productive in a couple of months. The title of the piece is Imaging the Global City, and she says, quote, "The speed and scale of urban transformation have become difficult to document. The contemporary megalopolis challenges the human capacity to picture the city. Nonetheless, in architectural and other print publications, the desire and need to make the contemporary city visible in a single framed photograph has led to a number of visual shorthands meant to evoke the complexities of globalization. Chief among them must be the tower rising in the middle of nowhere, or more poignantly, on the grounds of a former slum, an image mainstreamed and brought to Western viewers' homes by the uncanny savvy of the film Slumdog Millionaire in 2008. A related visual shorthand, usually only applied to non-Western metropolises, relentlessly juxtaposes new high-rise buildings with low-rise dwellings, often shanty towns, meant to evoke, but rarely explaining, the confluence of financial, demographic, and other streams at this particular location. A third visual strategy focuses on the heaps of garbage, cars, phones, low-rise buildings. Such juxtapositions and accommodations can then be read as differently connoted images of density, often telling us more about the writer than about the image, with interpretations ranging from cosmopolitanism, diversity, and exuberance to chaos and disorganization, end quote. In an essay titled The Political Agenda in the Crab by Jacques Rancière, he states that, quote, aesthetics, for its part, has its political agenda, concentrated between two forms that endlessly support and destroy each other at the same time. On the one hand, confidence in the power of perceptible forms to redefine a life in common. On the other, concern to counteract all the mechanisms that take these forms in the fabric of a collective meaning and restore them to the enigma or even to the splendor of their insignificance. Those artists are political in the true sense of the word, who are able to stage this tension between the collective feeling anticipated in the forms and the mute apolitical nature of these forms, end quote. And finally, this is the last quote. Slavoj Žižek, in Tarrying with the Negative, states that, quote, the problem lies in the radical infinitude of the affects. They are never all, since the totality of affects is never given to us. If this totality were to be given, we would have access to things in themselves. At this precise point, Hegel's critique of Kantian formalism intervenes. He identifies as a site of insufficiency not the finite nature of affects, but the abstract character of thought itself. The very need for affects, i.e., for a heterogeneous material to provide content to our intellect, bears witness to the fact that our thought is abstract formal, that it has not yet achieved the level of what Hegel calls absolute form, end quote. And I want to try to work through that with some of this material in the sense that I think what Zizek, Haney, and Rancière are saying is that in the kind of cultural constructions that that we're seeing in a contemporaneous way, we're not going to be able to satisfy the need to achieve a kind of political interpretation through taking the artistry at its own word, in fact. And so the notion that, going back to Mark Bradford, that the political may be embedded in the abstract, if we're looking at the forms, spaces, visual identifiers, and signifiers that have the more immediate resonance to us, that may in fact be the place that the political is not residing, or the place where the political is made the most insignificant, the least powerful. And so I think by looking at this notion of where does the political reside, you have to go through, in a way, the techniques that are used within the artifact itself to reveal where there is emptiness, where there is fullness to the signification of things, whatever those things may be, given the subject matter of the film, visual work, architecture, whatever. So there are deeper meaning-making constructions at work in Sala's films. If Long Sorrow is an ode to the developed city, Give Me Color is an ode to nostalgic forms of gentrification or pastiche. The amorphous space of the democratic state give way in both films to an expansive psychogeography of silence. On the one hand, the silence of the work of urban transformation, and on the other, the silence of built form itself. What is and does form communicate? In Sala's lamentations on these two distinct cities, one wealthy and European, the other poor and European, he does a couple of things simultaneously. He enacts a kind of globalization by not privileging locational characteristics which would make these two cities immediately knowable and decipherable. The enigmatic expanse of the filmic view, the camera, allows for a roving flaneur effect that acknowledges that the city, any city, cannot be adequately cohered by a single individual. The value added of his camera, particularly in Long Sorrow, is to produce a simulacra of the city, not a fragment, but a simulacra, a simulation of the city that stands not in adjacency for the entirety of the city, but for that percentage of the city, that interpretation of the city that we could only achieve individually. So none of us, there's probably many Detroits in this room. So when we simulate or put a simulacra of that, it's not to simulate every one of those images together, it's to simulate a notion that there is a moment or a sensibility that can be transferred into the filmic arena that provides that heterogeneity of material that Zizek refers to in the quote that I read a little bit earlier. So if cities are indeed, as Herzog and de Meuron say, petrified psychograms, then perhaps urbanism and the filmic sensibilities indexed, in fact, by Sala's films acknowledge the complexities of this city coherence problem, as well as the political content that can be and is always already embedded within these aesthetic things. And I like this image from Sala's films, where he's saying that when he first showed the film Give Me Color in Poughkeepsie, that Liam Gillick, the artist, said to him, you know, Anri, tell me the truth. Tell me that this city does not exist. Please tell me that you do not have an artist, mayor, friend. The center of that piece is what's interesting. Tell me that this city does not exist, which is, again, a kind of ode to a kind of simulacra that in fact could be speculative and not documentary in nature. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions and helpful dialogue. Yeah, John. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think when I was talking about kind of the nature-city distinction, I think that it seems that in that film, A, by shooting at night, and B, by kind of in a way abstracting the actual city to be to appear, particularly buildings, to appear more as surface, and then the ground, which is, as you said, it kind of ruin-like. I don't know whether it's under construction or it looks dug up in certain areas. But I think one of the things that happens when he films at night is that those, literally the color of the earth and the color of the buildings begin to kind of merge in a way that probably in some of the daytime shots seems much more distinct. And obviously there's more people there as well. So I think it seems like I'm just interpreting as a kind of person here, but it seems that that filmic move enables us to kind of reposition this city, which has got its challenges, in a much more optimistic light, both literally and kind of phenomenologically. And I think that ultimately, with the mayor coming at the end, and some of the overlaid text during those tracking shots, are trying to paint in a way kind of more optimistic picture of a place that without that commentary, without that overlay, would seem quite desperate and desolate in a way. So, I mean, even when I say desolate, I mean, but his shots also, in their optimism, also paint a fairly desolate place, right? So there's a paradox at work there that I think is effective, and I think when you first see the film, you kind of, what am I, guys filming, at night, but when you really engage it deeper, I think you begin to unpack some of these paradoxes, which I think are interesting for the broader context of visual culture, and how, again, the political is kind of embedded in some of these techniques. Yeah.
In this idea of the psychogeography of silence,
Mm-hmm.
can you outline again what those two examples were that you cited, or the way you parse that out?
The two visual examples of. Well, I think. So I was leveraging from the Herzog de Meuron petrified psychograms quote. I think when in talking about silence, I mean we celebrate, I think, positions that we might espouse for the city that become, through their utterance, become again very very optimistic and almost ubiquitous, right? I mean you've heard. We were just talking about the branding of cities, and somehow that naming a city, naming a part of a city a new name that somehow excites people and says that there's a freshness here. I guess what I'm saying is that in things like that, in techniques like that, there's what seems to be a kind of a transparency and a kind of utterance happening, but there's also a silencing that's happening as well. And in that silencing, there's a kind of a psychogeography of kind of getting accustomed to reading the utterances for what they're not saying, or reading the utterances for what they're obscuring. So I think that if I were to say to you, Highline, I don't know what would come to mind first, the $1 billion of real estate development along the Highline, or the historic uniqueness of the old railroad tracks existing sectionally kind of in midair in the city. I think that right there gets to kind of the paradox of how psychologically we're inhabiting a very optimistic terrain of the Highline, which I think is great. But at the same time, it's what may come to mind even without thinking about it is the commercial development, right? And so in a way that silences the historical or the political that may be embedded within the inherent kind of positioning of the landscape itself through the commercial lens. Yes, would be.
So in the context of the long sorrow, how do you read that in terms of like silencing as a verb?
I think in the long sorrow, what's interesting is that first of all, it's a fantastic pairing of these two for your visitors and for people to see. I think in Long Sorrow, it's more, the sound is so much a part of that film. The improvisational character of the film, image with sound, and how the camera's moving, how the image is being produced, and then to see the producer of the sound. And in a way, again, a paradox, I think, that what is not visually revealed, you have to almost infill with the sound. And you begin to kind of code the film according to how you're reading the improvisational production of sound. So that particularly when I found myself, watched it a couple of times, but I found myself trying to make relationships between the sound and the vacancy of the image, particularly in those shots where it's really there's really not a lot of things in the frame. And then when more color and more dichotomies begin to happen in the frame, I find myself focusing more on the visual character of the film. So I think in that he's using the camera to really constrain where you are, where the frame is, and at the same time he's infilling that with improvisational music, which starts the coding process for the viewer. And then of course that reverses itself, like I said, at least for me, when the visual comes forth more boldly, the music in a way recedes. So I think it also is an interesting way to kind of think about how we ourselves read the city, walk through the city, and there may be sounds, there may be visual images that we're not even paying attention to because something's taking kind of a primary role within our cognition of the city, for example. So I think it brings into question kind of how do we code the city, and how do we kind of manufacture a synthetic city for ourselves through the coding that we choose to interpret in that way. I don't know. Any other comments? Has everybody seen the films? Yeah.
Would you like to see them again?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.